Hello and welcome back. In this movie I'm going to show the different settings that FoliageMaker offers. As you know, FoliageMaker is a studio plugin that allows to grow procedural vegetation, foliage, and even use custom geometry nodes. It's a one-click solution, so you can just select an object and make the foliage. In this case I'm using the default settings. I will leave the first sphere on the left as a reference, and I will experiment the different options working on the sphere at the right. Quick note, each time that you click Make the Foliage, FoliageMaker will create a group node parented to the main object. Let me switch to perspective, so I will show you that basically this group node will contain a root node, a caps node, and a leaves node. I will hide each of these so you can see how the geometry is organized. So we have a node for all the branches and the caps that close each branch at the top, and the leaves. And of course, each of these geometries are textured, and they have UV mapping, so you can apply a different texture if you like. And as I'll show later, FoliageMaker also has a library with several materials for the leaves. Okay, so let's get back to the control settings. Let's start with the root type, which can be automatic or custom. In automatic, basically the vegetation, then the foliage will start from the root base point. So in this case, it will start from the bottom of the sphere, just where it's touched with the ground. This is the initial location for all the foliage to grow. But we can change that. If you don't like it like this, we can delete the group, and we switch to custom. And you'll see that we get this icon here, and this is the foliage root node, which you can move around, and it would basically decide where the growth has to start. So in this case, let me switch back to front view. If I select again the sphere and make the foliage, you'll see that the growth will start from this new location. Point of advice, don't put it too far, because if it's too far, of course, the roots will not find any point to reach the underlying geometry. So in this case, basically I get nothing. So always make sure that you drag the growth location in proximity of the object where it has to start, and then you make the foliage, and as you can see, this is the starting point of the vegetation. Next setting is the iterations. The iterations is basically how many growth loops it takes to complete the growth. There can be situations, and I'm going to show you one right now, where if, for example, I increase the vertical scale of this sphere. So basically, if I run the FoliageMaker with only 100 iterations, you'll see that basically the growth will stop before reaching the top. So in this case, we can increase the number of iterations to something like 250 maybe, and you see that now we have more cycles of growth, and the foliage is now reaching all the vertical extension of the underlying geometry. Okay, so I'm now going to delete the FoliageMaker group and I will get back the sphere at 100% vertical scale, and at any time you can reset the FoliageMaker options by clicking this button here. Okay, so I'm getting back to the default settings. So now the growth pattern variation. If you run the FoliageMaker with this variation set at 1, 2, 3, 4, basically the outcome for the branches is always the same. So it doesn't matter how many times I run the simulation. And as you can see, if I compare it with the branches that are on the first sphere, the one on the left, okay, so you see that basically we have the same outcome because the pattern is always set at 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's the same noise base that we are using. So if we want a different result, so the branches growing in different patterns and directions, we can basically delete this and scramble the pattern variation to some other value. And now that we start again the FoliageMaker, you'll see that now all the branches are different because we have used a different base for our random generator. Okay, so I reset the options, and now we take a look at the growth complexity, which basically will establish how many growth points to acquire from the underlying geometry. So the default is 1. If I try, for example, 4, you'll see that I get a lot of more of these tiny yellow dots. The growth is sensibly slower because we are now generating a lot more branches. And you can see also visually that we have a more complex network of twigs. And it indeed takes more time to compute, but the result, of course, is more complex. You see, we have more foliage and more complexity, more overall complexity with the outcome of our simulation. Okay, the growth rate, which is next control setting, is basically the speed at which the growth occurs. On small geometries like this one, which is 1 meter, probably it's not going to do any good because in this occasion you see that the growth is very fast, and you see basically it will skip points during the growth. So as you can see, the result will be a very simulation with really little count of twigs and branches. So if I eventually go all the way up to 10, you see that it gets very sparse, and it depends if this is something that you need. I advised to use larger growth rate values if you have large objects like, I don't know, the wall of a building or something like that. If you have a large object which is maybe 10 or 20 meters, and it can speed up the overall simulation, and you will still get a good result. On small objects like this, it's probably better to leave it at 2 or 3. Okay, next setting is the twig geometry quality. 2 values, 1 or 2. To demonstrate this, I will first run the simulation with the twig geometry quality set at 1, and I will delete leaves and caps, just take the root and move it somewhere here, and then I'll run it again with the quality set at 2, which takes more time and will produce a more detailed branches structure with more hook points for the leaves. And as you can see, it takes also more time to compute. But if I go back here and let me remove leaves and caps, I also hide the sphere so that we basically compare. This is the geometry that we produced with a setting of 1, and this with a setting of 2. As you can see, we have more loops in the geometry. The overall quality, if you take a look also at the curvature of the twigs, is much better because we don't have these sharp corners and jagged directions that we have done previously, and overall is a much better geometry structure that you get versus the one that we achieve with the setting of 1. Of course, keep in mind that setting it at 2 takes more time and resources, so just use it as you please. Okay, next setting is the twig surface distance. This is an interesting setting. Let's see what happens if I, for example, set the value at 3, and as you can see, the twigs will progressively grow distant from the underlying object. And this can be quite interesting for a few projects where you don't want the branches to be really attached to the object, like it happened with the first sphere. So here we have the twigs quite far from the geometry, and we can go even more extreme and try, for example, 7, and in this case you'll see how the simulation will stop, and this is because 100 iterations won't be sufficient to cover all the growth. So what we can do is can increase the number to, well, let's try 400. This should be enough. And so now, okay, the branches will complete, and so you can see how the twigs now will grow quite far from the underlying object. Maximum value allowed is 10. Okay, next setting is the twig vertical reach. With a value of 100, we basically cover the whole vertical extension, and so the branches will grow all the way up to the very top of our underlying geometry. If we, for example, set it at somewhere around 50, it will approximately grow just around the half extension of the underlying model. It's not very precise. I mean, there is some tolerance, but there you have it. If, for example, you want just to grow a short amount of foliage, you basically set it, for example, at 20, and you basically go with branches that cover just about the 20% of the model. This can be interesting to use, for example, with I don't know, statue models or characters, and you, for example, don't want the foliage to cover the head, then you can use this slider to establish at which height you want the foliage cover to grow. Okay, so twig radius and radius decay are self-explanatory. I can, for example, increase the twig radius at 3, and I will get thicker branches. Let me hide the leaves. So you see these are obviously clearly more thick than the sphere on the left. And if I, for example, null the radius decay, all I'll get will be basically cylinders growing. And if I increase the radius decay at 100, the size of the twigs will sharply decrease over time, even if the radius at the base is quite large, and in this case is 3. Okay, to demonstrate the foliage density and growth bias, first let me delete the group here. Let me try to use the sphere on the left with a foliage density of 10. Okay. Okay, as you can see, we have quite an extensive cover of foliage. On the sphere on the right, I will use the same setting, but I will increase the growth bias to 100. What this will do will basically skip growing foliage on the main supporting twigs and concentrate growth, especially on the smaller twigs. In fact, as you can see, the main branches are free from the foliage, and the foliage will concentrate on the very end. So this could be an interesting effect that you want to use. Maybe what I could have done is to increase the foliage a bit more, so that the effect is more obvious. Okay, so this is it. Very low bias, in this case 0, so foliage covering all the twigs and branches without distinction, and in this case on the right the foliage will cover the terminal twigs. Okay, in FoliageMaker we can even use instancing, a technique that in this case will allow to replace the leaves with custom geometry. So in this case I'm going to use a rose prop that I have, and if I select my base object and I go here and say in instancing, I say select an object or group, and I pick my rose and I make the foliage. Okay, as it finishes to run, you will notice nothing, but the instances are there, and you can show where they are placed using this button here, the on-off button. And to see them, you can even trigger the iRay preview, and there they are. So you see the rows have been grown and attached to the underlying branches and twigs, and they basically inherit the settings that we have in the panel. So as you can see here, you can it tells foliage instant density and the growth bias, the size and size variation that I explained previously. So this is a powerful technique because, as I will show in a moment, we can even mix a network, a group of different props, and create really stunning results. To build up from what I just said, in this example I increased the vertical scale of the main object, and I use a bit of twig surface distance to have the branches growing a bit far from the underlying surface, and you can understand how versatile and how many combinations you can really achieve with the FoliageMaker. And even more so if we use several different props and objects that we can instantiate. In this example I have a selection of 4 roses. I mean, it's basically the same red rose that I've shown a few minutes ago, and then I have a pink, a yellow and a white version. So what we can do in the FoliageMaker, I can group these props into a single group, and I can call it like rose group. Okay, so here is the collection. Then I go to the front view. Let me switch back to text mode. So now what I can do is select the torus in this case, and instead of instantiating a single flower, I will just instantiate the whole group. So I get the rose group. I just experimented with a few settings, and I now make the foliage. So what the FoliageMaker will do this time, it will basically mix whatever object is in this collection, so the 4 roses, and produce a foliage which doesn't have leaves but just these 4 objects. Okay, so let's get to the array preview, and here it comes. So to resume, we can use you can use the FoliageMaker and on any type of geometry. So far I've been using props like spheres, an imported statue, 3D model, or a torus in this case, but you can also use the FoliageMaker on a Genesis character, one of my animal models, etc. And you can instantiate on that object any kind of geometry. So not only static meshes like I did just now, but you can even use characters. So instead of these roses, you could maybe have 4 different posed versions of a Genesis character and instantiate those ones. Okay, last control setting that we have left out is their instance random rotation. This is quite self-explanatory. It basically establishes how much of a random rotation is applied for each instance. The interesting fact about this is that if I set it to 0 and I run the FoliageMaker, basically all the instances will point downwards in a vertical fashion. So, and this can be quite interesting for a number of projects, like in this example where I have a Christmas ornament ball that I instantiated on my object, and I want those to all point downwards instead than having a random rotation. So thank you much for your attention, and I hope you will have a lot of fun using the FoliageMaker.